運が悪かったんだよ、お前らは。
2016 is an interesting year for the Yakuza series. Not only has the year started off with a complete remake of the very first game in the series, but it's also going to be capped off with the long-awaited 6th entry in the series, which aims to reinvent the franchise's combat system and world once again as the first entry developed specifically for the current generation of consoles. The series is moving forward to its next big chapter, so why not use this chance to prime fans for a fresh new entry with a recreation of the first game, which had a lot of flaws, to show how far the series has come since its inception. It's a great idea for this team to undertake, and we'll be looking at both of these games today, first with a remake entitled Kiwami, and then moving on to the demo for 6, which was included with it for free. These games aren't as heavy of topics as previous entries, as we've already discussed a lot of what makes up Kiwami in previous videos, and the other is just a demo, so I'm hoping to make this a briefer video than usual. To start off, Kiwami is a remake that is very true to the original. Kiwami actually translates to extreme, but there really isn't much extreme about it. Unlike something like the Final Fantasy VII remake, which aims to completely remake and change the original it's based on to fit into their current vision of what it should be like, even going as far as to change its genre in an attempt to appeal to a wider variety of customers, Kiwami is a much smaller endeavor that only aims to repackage the franchise's inciting incident in a format more in line with its current advancements, while preserving virtually everything about the original story and structure. But that probably has more to do with the fact that this is a very low budget affair, even when compared to the other entries in the series. While other entries in the series have always relied on reusing assets and animations, Kiwami is almost designed around it, and it's clear they were only able to take this opportunity to make this remake because so much of Zero was already so similar to the first game that their main focus would only have to be on recreating characters and environments exclusive to it. Aside from a fresh coat of paint, the game's cutscenes and story beats are virtually identical, even down to animations and cutscenes being borrowed straight from the original. This is less a reinterpretation of the original game as much as it is the original game with small enhancements built around its framework. Then, the combat system itself is borrowed straight from Zero with some slight improvements, completely replacing the original's stilted combat with what is probably the most versatile and smooth system in the series. So really, there isn't that much to talk about here that I haven't already detailed in my previous 2 Yakuza videos, so for the most part I'm only going to be talking about differences and how well those differences work to improve the original game. Now, I'm gonna preface this video by stating that while it may come across as negative, that's just because we already know that certain aspects of the game that I've discussed in previous videos are great, like the combat, so a majority of what I'm left with are niggling issues I have with this remake that I feel like mentioning. I'm pretty critical of Kiwami because I respect the original Yakuza and its place in the series is the foundation that the rest of the games grew from. These criticisms may come across more than the positives in this video, but don't take this as a sign that I thought the game was bad. It really isn't. It's just very similar to previous games, Zero especially. I'm also critical because I know there are a lot of people watching this wanting to know if this is a worthy substitute to play in place of the original, and I want to make sure I'm suggesting what will create the best overall experience of the franchise. There's a lot about this remake that I'm conflicted about, but it doesn't change that what's here is still a big improvement. Instead of being a series of small disconnected areas strung together to form the setting of Kamurocho, Kiwami's world is seamless like the recent games, meaning you don't have to contend with constant loading interruptions while moving around the city and when transitioning into battles like in the original. With the added graphical fidelity comes a greater sense of personality to the city and its inhabitants, especially with the more drawn-in camera it uses. In the original, citizens barely had faces, but now they look much more fully realized, meaning even side quests have a lot more character and the humor of some of them comes across a lot more. Speaking of which, a lot of the side quests from the original game return unchanged, but a few are actually expanded upon and more fleshed out, and then there are a bunch of totally new ones. While the combat system returns almost unchanged from Zero, the small improvements they've made do a lot to unify the 4 styles. One of the things I wanted to see in Zero were style transitions that were more instantaneous, like something out of DMC4 or Ishin, and Kiwami actually does add this. You can switch styles the same way you did in Zero normally, but you can also quickly switch after performing combos, dodging, or if you're knocked down on the floor. This steps up the fighting system considerably and makes switching between the styles frequently a much more viable option. Heat has also gone back to the red heat system from 3 and 4, and all of the heat moves are carried over from 0. There are some new ones, but these can only be performed when an enemy begins to rest during combat. This is a new mechanic, sort of similar to the feel the heat sections in Yakuza 3, but now they regenerate their health and you're given the option to counteract it by performing these new heat moves with the style that corresponds with the color they begin to glow. Okay, it's nice to see some original heat moves in the game, but this rest mechanic that triggers them is kind of annoying. When you're fighting an enemy that already has 5 health bars and then they begin to regenerate their health 2 or 3 times per fight, it just gets monotonous. The JoJo style punching move is amazing though, and definitely lives up to the extreme title. You now start out with the Dragon of Dojima style, which is just Kazuma style from 5 that they added as a fun little unlockable in 0 for fans who put in the effort. It made sense in that game that Kazuma would still be an unrefined brawler trying to find his own way of fighting, but eventually would refine his 3 very different fighting styles into one ultimate one. The whole series actually had this really cool sense of continuity going on, where from game to game Kazuma would remember moves he learned in previous ones, and it was even brought up and justified in funny ways if he somehow forgot some. Now Kazuma sort of begins the game with the Dragon of Dojima style, kind of implying that this is his go-to style, but then they add in the other 3 from 0 just for the added variety. Then, after Kazuma gets sent to jail for 10 years, he comes back and still has all of his styles, but they've all been gimped, his Dragon of Dojima style especially. This adds this sort of Symphony of the Night power loss element to the game that wasn't in the original, and I know this is a design trope that many people aren't a fan of. This means the game is about regaining your abilities and then some, and Majima now plays a huge role in this. Unlike the original, where Majima was a twisted and unpredictable villain who was tasked with taking you out, resulting in a few memorable fights, Kiwami has an entire pillar of the game built around Majima fights. It's called the Majima Anywhere system, and it's basically an expanded on version of those big dudes who constantly fought you for money in 0. Majima will roam the streets and hide in bizarre places in order to fight you and build up your Dragon of Dojima style. He has all sorts of interesting costumes and premises behind his fights, and they can get pretty weird. This adds a humorous element to the entirety of the story, which is welcome, but it also requires a ton of dedication. Unless you dedicate hours and hours to just Majima fights during a single playthrough, you probably won't have a fully upgraded Dragon of Dojima style by the end of the game. I enjoyed this system, but I definitely think it could have been toned down a lot, because it's no fun to have a 4th style that's barely usable because it lacks the basic moves it had in previous games. The Majima system is also just weird to think about thematically. Remember when I said that Majima and Kazuma never met or fought each other in 0, the game that focused on them exclusively? Well, now you get to Kiwami, the game that's technically a sequel, and it's packed to the brim with Majima fights, including the ones that were there originally and actually fit into the story. It's just sorta weird how there's such a huge focus on the relationship of Kazuma and Majima when this is a game about Kazuma and Nishiki's relationship. 0 had some amazing character moments with Nishiki, and this is the game where that friendship they built up should pay off as the focus. The 2 Majima fights from the original now clash tonally with the crazy antics you're having with him constantly outside of the main story, and it almost cheapens them because they're just a few of many you have with him all the time. The reason Majima was bandaged during your second fight with him was because he got himself stabbed to protect Kazuma after their first fight. It was a surprise because it was the first time you heard from him since the incident and didn't expect him to come after you in a state like this. But because you fight Majima so many times, they had to create an entirely new reason for him to be bandaged during that fight by adding this strange sequence with you co-oping a bunch of guys with Majima at the harbor where he ends up being shot. It's just such a weird, unnecessary complication to the original game's story. Why even bother giving Majima a bandage during this scene if it was just gonna make you have to create a whole new justification? They could have taken more small creative liberties to mitigate these clashing ideas. While I wanted the game to be faithful to the original, the story didn't need to be brought over wholesale. Well, I guess that isn't entirely true. There are some added cutscenes to the game, and some even have expanded sections. For example, they added an extra section to the cutscene where you meet Majima that wasn't in the original. Now, between chapters, you're treated to several cutscenes dedicated to Nishiki's descent into villainy, which does a better job illustrating why he became the power-hungry man he is after Kazuma got sent to jail. The ring Kazuma gave Yumi has a bit more of an origin story now, with a flashback section at the beginning of the game that shows Kazuma buying it for her birthday. This wasn't in the original, but these added cutscenes are just nice to see because you get to experience the relationship between these characters a lot more, which was something that was sort of missing in the original with its very brief opening. Yumi is a character I've always wanted to see more of because for such a major character, she barely appeared in the original game. 0 would have been a good chance to have her appear a few more times, but she wasn't in that game, so getting to see her in a new cutscene or two in Kiwami is at least something. The game's presentation is obviously a huge step up from the original, presenting a bright and stylized version of Kamurocho, but at the same time, I can't help but prefer the original game's more subdued lighting and tone with its charming PS2 graphics. You can really tell in the cutscenes when they're just using the animations from the original game, including lip movements. Most of the time, characters will have really floaty looking animations in cutscenes and their mouths will just sort of open and close with their words, but at other times, like in any of the new scenes, you can tell the animations and lip movements are up to current standards. It's sort of jarring if you pay attention to it, and I think the entire remake would have been improved greatly if they at the very least redid all of the lip syncing. You can update the models as much as you want, but that just makes this sort of stuff extra noticeable if you don't update it as well. It's hard to say if I'm expecting too much from the game because I know it was probably made with a $10 budget, but I think if they were gonna do this remake, they should have done more. The fact that the game is such a Frankenstein's monster of animations, systems, graphics, and minigames from previous games makes it a bit disappointing because Yakuza 1 was wholly original when it came out. It was a completely fresh new game, so to see it remade into something so derivative of past entries sort of rubs me the wrong way. Take the boss fights for example. Every single one of them is either lifted from Yakuza 1 or taken straight from another boss in the series. If you're as big of a fan of these games as I am, you're gonna recognize these stances and moves instantly. I really thought this was gonna be the one area where Kiwami was going to shine and really improve on the original, because Yakuza 1 had some bogus fights. The solution should have been to take their concepts and rework them into great fights, not just lift older bosses that sort of fit the character. Some of the fights in the game are just as frustrating as they were in the original, like the second to last one, and that shouldn't still be the case because we know they're able to create much better fights than this now. The only fight that doesn't suck anymore despite not being changed at all is the one against this annoying guy only because of the rush style allowing you to dodge his guns easily. Another reason this remake is a weird case is because Zero already had a ton of sections that felt like they were remaking parts of the first game, and in that game it really did feel like a huge improvement because it was put in a new context with totally fresh mechanics. Take the Tojo HQ escape or even the rail shooter section from Zero, which were obvious callbacks. It was sort of a more creative way of remaking choice sections from the original without having to completely remake it. It's not that I think either is better, because I do like the idea of remaking the original into a better game, but now we have both renditions of these scenes and it's a little redundant. As I said, I know there are a ton of you out there hoping this will be the game to play in place of the original, but I'm having a tough time recommending it for that purpose. I'm not saying this is worse than the original, but if you're starting this franchise for the first time, I still suggest starting from the original game and moving through the series in release order. It's just the nature of the original game, being the foundation of everything to come, that makes it the right choice for playing if you're gonna then move on to the second game and so on. Its combat system, graphical style, and tone are all part of the experience that made it the first entry in this constantly improving series. Playing them out of order messes up that sense of progression as the games get better and better and could result in you being underwhelmed by the sequels moving forward. The second game is still my personal favorite entry in the series, but I don't know how I would have enjoyed it if I played it after Kiwami, especially when its combat is just the first game's but improved in every way. If Kiwami is your first entry in the series, when you move on to the future games in the series and run into the bosses Kiwami ripped the movesets off of for its bosses, they're gonna be totally deflated. Personally, I think Kiwami is best served as a nice throwback for fans who already played Zero and want to experience the first game again in a new way, not as the definitive version of it, like I was expecting. But if you're someone who already jumped straight into one of the later entries, then sure, play Kiwami in place of the original just so it doesn't feel like a drag going backwards to a game with none of the improvements that were built upon it in its sequels. Well, enough of Kiwami for now. Hopefully you understood what I was trying to convey, but let's move on to the demo for 6 to round this video off. I don't want to go too much into the game right now just because I'll probably make a video on the full game when it comes out later this year. For now, I just want to talk about some of the major differences here and how it looks to be shaping up. For starters, 6 is obviously a huge step up graphically. There's so much more detail to everything, from character models in the environment to lighting effects and how much stuff there is going on in the city at a single time. This really is the first major step up in graphics since the third game, and with it comes a much greater sense of interactivity and believability. The world is now totally seamless, giving Kazuma the ability to walk in and out of stores naturally. Items that litter the streets are affected by physics even out of combat, and Kazuma can explore the interiors of Kamurocho to a greater extent than ever before. The graphics aren't the thing that excites me, it's how they work with the added level of interactivity to bring a whole new dimension to the city. The new openness of the city allows for fights to take place in locations you've never fought in before. You can even parkour around rooftops now, bringing the opportunities for exploration up even further. It's amazing how this series continues to find new ways to expand on this already incredibly rich setting, as if interesting places like this existed just under our noses the whole time. The only problem is that with this added detail comes a sacrifice in frame rate and resolution. The PS4 just can't pull this intense stuff off, so the game is being scaled back from the 1080p 60 frames per second goodness that Ishin, Zero, and Kiwami had and is being taken down to 900p at 30 frames per second. This is a huge bummer in my opinion, and now I really hope either this PS4 Neo thing ends up making games like this run better, or Sega continues their recent streak of bringing games to PC with this one. I mean, it wasn't like it was a big deal to bring this team's other game, Binary Domain, to PC back when it launched. It's unfortunate that progress has to come at the price of fluidity and clarity, but we all knew this was going to happen once they moved away from developing the games with the PS3 in mind. I'm pretty sure the demo is actually sub 32, which has a noticeable effect on how fast and responsive combat feels in comparison to Kiwami. Combat has been reinvented again, which is one of the reasons I understand why they'd want to get another use out of Zero's combat system in Kiwami. This time they're doing a lot of interesting stuff like integrating physics into animations. Your attacks look like they're making contact with enemies much more believably, and you're able to pull off a lot of really stylish new moves. There's just something about the weightiness of combat that makes it feel different than the previous games. Heat has also been revamped again too, and now you sort of have to activate it by entering a burst mode, which then sends you into an enhanced fighting style where you hit harder and faster. Only in this mode can you perform heat moves, which are all original as far as the demo is concerned. Now there are even these heat combo finishers where you continue to hit a button to add as much power to a single blow, sending your enemy flying. Kazuma's moveset feels like they decided to start from scratch and just make whatever moves they wanted to, instead of trying to evolve his previous styles even further. They all look cool, but sort of lack a strategic purpose. I was just sort of hitting buttons and stuff was happening when in previous games you knew what effect a certain combo would have on an enemy and you'd take advantage of that. I can see how the leg sweep combo would come into play for bypassing enemy defenses, but that's really all I can think of right now. It's great for fighting off swarms of enemies at once though, which might be something they're focusing on more in this entry. There's a giant street brawl at one point in the demo that's a real spectacle. Watching enemies fall all over each other is really entertaining. Combat is a little less responsive than you'd want it to be, with there being some delay between you pressing a button and what's happening on screen. This has something to do with how Kazuma has this sort of wind-up to his movements in an effort to be more realistic. This gives combat this weird start and stop feeling, with animation speeds conflicting with each other, leaving the player unable to truly get a grasp of when to time attacks. This is just a demo, so hopefully this will all be sorted out by the time the actual game is out. I don't think this is all to blame on the frame rate, as I never had this feeling playing the PS3 titles. One thing I can see getting really annoying is how Kazuma's default walking speed is now really slow as a way to make walking through the interiors of buildings more manageable. Now you're almost always holding down the run button to get to places, which is something games like Assassin's Creed do that gets really obnoxious after a while. Having the player character walk around slowly can give the setting a more down-to-earth atmosphere, but in actual practice it just means you'll be holding down a button the whole time you're exploring the city. The camera could use a lot of work too. I'm not sure how to describe the problem with it because it just sort of has a mind of its own. It likes to get really close to the action and change its perspective based on what it thinks is important. It's also really slow to move around, lacking any sort of sensitivity option, at least in the demo. It's sort of nauseating at times trying to corral the camera into careening in the direction you want it in, especially with the frame rate and how much motion blur is in the game. I've never had a single problem with the camera system they had going in the previous games. It was fast, snappy, and always focused in on what you wanted it to. Though I do enjoy how much flexibility you have over the camera now. In the previous games you couldn't maneuver the camera vertically very much, but now you can move it all over the place and get it really close to Kazuma's face to appreciate every strand of hair on his furrowed brow. This demo feels so well put together, especially on a technical level, but at the same time there's a lot to improve. For a series with such a small budget, it's crazy to see them come out with something looking this good, and I'm sure the funds from Kiwami are what enabled them to do this. Everything in this demo, from the cutscenes and scenario to Kazuma's design, was made just for the demo and won't be the way things are in the full game. It's so cool they included this whole thing with Kiwami because it's like a big Ground Zeroes tier tech demo, except you aren't being charged for it. It'll be great to see how the final game turns out, and I can't wait to explore the rest of Kamurocho to this degree. Who knows what other locations this story might take us to, or if other characters will join us on the adventure and be playable. I'm hoping we get to see the return of the characters from 5 to some degree because it's actually been a while since the mainline story last continued in 2012. And like I said in previous videos, the games actually do take place in real time, so 4 years have most likely passed since the end of 5, and it'll be interesting to see where all of the characters have landed since then. We get a brief scene of Haruka at the very end of the demo, who should be in her 20s by now, and it's going to be really cool to see old characters show up all updated and super detailed. I do have hopes for the future of the series, but I sort of feel like we've fallen out of the golden age that was 5, Ishin, and 0 all releasing back to back. Kiwami is a good game, but a little too awkward conceptually and in execution for me to think it's another home run for the series. Then I'm a little worried about whether or not 6 will turn out to be a truly great game or get tangled up trying too hard to be a great tech demo instead. I'm sure that over time Kiwami will grow on me more, and I know I've been a bit hard on it, but that's just because I'm such a fan, which makes me the most critical. Despite its many improvements, Kiwami just wasn't the leap I expected from a remake, as it still retains a lot of weird design choices from the original that I expected them to improve. Just because you were keeping the story intact didn't mean that when it transitions to gameplay you had to retain every bit of encounter design that made the original frustrating in sections. It's almost too true to the original in some ways. I definitely still recommend it to fans of the series, especially because of what it adds to the story, but this isn't really a must-play. Absolutely give it a go if you're interested, but don't lose sleep over it, especially if you've already played the original and 0. Imagine those two experiences mixed up and you've got Kiwami. The small improvements to combat do make a big difference, technically pushing it ahead of 0 in that regard, but the overall package isn't as strong, especially since it stands on the shoulders of just Kazuma without Majima's combat to double the fun. It would have been amazing if the Nishiki cutscenes were tied into a small additional campaign centered around playing as him, similar to the additional stories of Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition. Now that would have been pushing it to the next level. But as it is, I feel the first game is best experienced in its original context as a flawed little PS2 game that inspired the rest of the series. You could also just play both versions eventually. Problem solved. I really hope 6 blows my socks off, and I'll definitely let you guys know if it does when that time comes. It's doing a lot of awesome new things, and I really like how fresh its mechanics and world are. They released this demo to get feedback for the final release, and I really hope some of it was able to make a difference. These developers have shown they know how to make great games many times in the past, so I know they can do it again. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and see you all next time.
なとない誓いのそうとない場所